Hey, it's Mr. Keys, and in this video we're going to learn about a music concept that really separates an amateur sounding progression from a professional sounding one. We're going to talk about voice leading.
What we gonna do right here is go back. Way back. Back into time.
Back in the day, when choir music was a thing, choir members would be designated into different groups like soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and would sing different notes at the same time. This is known as harmony. These parts are also known as voices. There were certain rules put into place for composers writing these harmonies. Parts that were difficult to sing were always frowned upon. For example, a part that jumped a lot would be considered difficult to sing. A part that didn't jump too often was considered smooth and was desirable. This is what is known as smooth voice leading, and that's what we're going to learn about today, because it still applies all these hundreds of years later. Concept 1. Smooth versus skipping. If we have an E and it moves to an F, that would be smooth motion because E is beside F. However, E to G would be considered a skip because we're skipping F to get to G. For our purposes, we only have to smoothly voice lead the highest note of each chord, since this is the note that listeners will hear. Concept 2. Melody. I will call the highest note of each chord the melody note of the chord, since the combinations of top notes of each chord will form a melody. My goal when creating a chord progression is to always create a singable melody, which means a combination of skips, but mainly smooth connections. I'll play a little example. Let's go through the following progression. A minor, C, F, G major, A minor, E minor, F, and G major again. The G major is simply a passing chord that leads us back to A minor each time, but since it's in the chord progression, it gets the same smooth voice leading treatment as everything else. Let's jump into logic for this one. We're going to use the piano roll editor first, and then I'll do it again with the chord trigger plugin. The notes that we use for the first chord will determine the voicing for the chords that follow. So let's create a little MIDI region right here, and we'll make it 4 bars long. Down here I'll turn on note labels just so that you can see the name of the notes. Let's use the brush tool, and we'll set the quantized value to half notes. That will allow us to draw half notes for our chords. For A minor, we need A, C, and E. I'll start the chord at A1. I'll just zoom out a little bit. So that's an A1. You can see it right there. We have A2, E3, and let's make our melody note C4, and I'll just fill in the gap with A3 right here. The highest note of the chord is the only note that we need to keep track of. We want to make sure that the next chord, which is C major, has a top note that is as close to or the same as the highest note of A minor. The highest note of A minor is C, and C major is C, E, G, so we can actually just make it C. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the chord. So I'll make this my lowest note, and then I'll just fill in from here. So I have 3 C's already. I need an E and a G. There's my E, or my G, and there's my E. And so there we go. So what this does is it makes the transition between the two chords very smooth, since our top note is the same. And don't forget that when we're creating chords, we need to follow all the rules that we learned about in the last video about open chord voicings. So make sure that you have all the notes from the chord, make sure that there's gaps in the low end of the chord, and smaller gaps in the higher end of the chord. Make sure that your chord width is less than 3 octaves, etc., etc. Okay, let's move on to our next chord, F major. Now, F major also has a C in it, but this time I'm going to drop our top note down to A. This would not be an example of smooth voice leading because it's a jump to go from C to A since we're skipping B in the process. But this is fine because skips can add interest to a melody and a chord progression. A good rule of thumb would be to have 70% of your melody notes moving smoothly and maybe 30% jumps. So having a jump every now and then wouldn't be so bad. All right, let's fill in the rest of the chord for F major. So I need an F, that will be my bass note. And then I'm going to fill in the gaps here. So I'm going to place a C and then an F. There we go. All right, let's move on to G major. Now, one little thing is our F major chord, I'm just going to zoom in so I can see all the notes. Our F major chord is actually 3 beats. So I need to pull this over. Okay, let's zoom back out. All right, so for G major, I'm going to move my melody note to here. I'm actually going to switch my quantized value to chord note because I only want 1 beat. And then I'll fill in the chord. There we go, there's G major. Now, since my first chord, A minor, has a C on top, I'm just going to copy that chord over here and use it again. My next chord after that is E minor, so I'll actually make a jump this time as well. So it's going to jump down. Oh, let's switch the quantized value back to half note. Our melody note for the E minor chord will be G, so there's going to be another jump. So we have smooth, jump, smooth, smooth, jump. All right, and I'll select my bass note and then fill in the gaps. Perfect. The next chord after that is going to be F. And this one is also going to be 3 beats long. And let's go to F. And I'll just make all these 3 beats long. And then we have our G major chord, and we can do that really quickly. And there we have it. There's our chord progression. Let's take a listen to how it sounds. You can see when it wraps around that it smoothly leads from B back to C. And that's exactly what we want. We want most of the chord progression to be smooth with occasional jumps here and there. All right, I'm just going to move this over and we're going to redo this with our chord trigger plugin. So let's go to MIDI effects, chord trigger, and make sure it's on multi. And I'm going to go through the same process really quickly. Let's click on learn. Our first chord is A minor, so I'll use C, the octave of C6, so A6, and A minor. Here we go. Okay, my next chord is C major, so I'm going to keep that same C. Get rid of that G. And then I have F next, and I think I jump down for the F. And then G. And we're back to A. And then we have E minor. And E minor, the melody note dropped down to G. There we go. And then we'll just recycle the F. So E minor to F moves smoothly. You can see the notes right there. E minor has a G on top, F has a on top, and G has a B on top. So they're already perfectly in line. That's kind of one of the limitations of this method, is that if you want to have different versions of the chords, you'd have to use more trigger notes, which is fine. You can use the ones below C1, like the C0 octave, to do that. and or you can even use the C5 octave. Like you notice, none of my notes went that high, so you can use that if you want. One more thing with chord trigger. If you find that you're using the same chord voicings over and over and over again, you might want to actually save this. So if you go to this drop-down menu and go to Save As, then you can give it a name. So you can save it as whatever, C major chords, and it will save right into here, and then you can always recall it. So let me just save that. And now if I clear this, so recall default, and then I recall C major chords, it has all my chords, which is amazing. So that way you don't have to do this every single time you create a new project. But the thing is that what I find is when I create new projects, I always want different voicings depending on what I'm trying to do. But, you know, maybe you can save a whole bunch of different versions and then you can kind of cycle between them. That's one idea. So that's about it for this lesson. We learned about skips and smooth voice leading, creating melody lines with our chord progressions, and more. Hope this helps.